What's up, guys? My name is Fari, and I build systems that remove bottlenecks within businesses. And I've been documenting my builds since the 1st of June 2025, going all the way up to the 1st of June 2026. And in today's video, I'm going to be talking to you about, the process of learning and how that has ultimately shifted my perspective, especially with the daily videos and also building out a bunch of different things at the same time. So with the daily videos, one of the things that I truly never really expected or was always a big fan of was the process of learning. And that process of learning where you ultimately, being able to connect the dots in terms of different, systems and processes that ultimately run and learning how they ultimately function as well has been something that, has pushed me to, produce these daily videos on a day to day. Just the process of, thinking of one specific topic and then being able to basically compress that topic into like a word or like a Figma board and then ultimately like present that has ultimately been something that has really shifted my perspective and allowed me to learn a lot more on a day to day. And that has also impacted me in so many ways in terms of understanding that each and every single day you can formulate different ideas and test those ideas if you also have a means to also generate these ideas. And I saw a post the other day about from Dan Coe, and he mentioned something along the lines of if you don't read, how do you expect to gain ideas? If you don't read books, you don't listen or consume knowledge. And this is also reference to one of the videos that I made, when to stop consuming and when to start building, which I think has been something that I've thought about for a long time in terms of fully understanding consumption is very important. You need to consume in order to get new ideas, get new things that you can ultimately learn and absorb, and also recognize patterns from, and also test that as well, because I believe there's so much knowledge out there, and knowledge somewhat becomes useless, like my previous video that I made, if it's not broken down and it's not compressed and organized into a structure that ultimately works and functions as a system that ultimately allows you to add on to your execution there. I think that is also super important. And for me, just forcing myself and saying each and every single day, I need to make sure that I'm consuming enough to ultimately learn and come up with new ideas and recognize different patterns, but also to have enough to also build as well. Because I think that is one of the most, advanced things that, I've been able to, or things that have been able to advance my way of thinking and execution as well. Just being able to solely just understand that through knowledge and the process of learning and gaining knowledge and understanding how to then organize this knowledge and implement it has been something that has allowed me to push throughout each and every single day, especially with these videos. It's super fun. I never expected that one of the fun or the most fun part about making these videos and also challenging part is also just coming up with ideas, learning and consuming, so much so that I have a bunch of different ideas that ultimately allow me to then, somewhat test them in a video format and also see how those respond. And also understanding this process loop of, understanding the inputs, which are, the consumption, the books, the podcast, whatever the medium is that I'm ultimately taking, and the processes that I'm basically, using in order to 10x the output, which is, the one thing that I also ultimately want to do, which is making sure that each and every bit of information that I'm consuming is filtered in the sense that it makes sense and it ultimately fuels the execution there. Because so much so, you can consume so much knowledge and you can learn a bunch of different things, but does that fuel or directly correlate to the things that you're ultimately building on a day to day? And that is a question that I always ask myself, of what am I learning today and how is it fueling the things that I need to get done into the future, not just today, but into the future as well. And how am I also using these different ideas and different things that I'm learning on a day to day to ultimately test quick and also, find out, hey, does this work? And can I implement it in what I'm doing? And if it, fails or it succeeds, then good. You ultimately learn a lot more from your failures, especially in my instance, that I've learned a lot more in the things that didn't work out. And that's why, or was the reason why I ultimately, started going super deep in terms of building out the, Fari OS that I've spoken about in a previous video, where you ultimately have this, document, not a document, but this Notion board that ultimately represents your knowledge base. So basically, every single book, idea, everything that you've consumed and the patterns you've then been able to recognize from that consumption and how to also implement it and gaining clarity through that. Because I think, in many instances, just doing the thing that needs to get done ultimately allows you to formulate that level of clarity that pushes you through to just, ultimately gain that knowledge as well. And that means, through just doing stuff, you then ultimately add more towards that execution there. And through that execution there, you're also able to iterate. And I always like to say, iteration is the key to innovation, which is something that I've always, have held strong within me, understanding that iteration is key to innovation, that your V1 won't always be perfect, but ultimately learning through that and understanding that there are different processes and different loops that ultimately govern how you're then able to learn and also execute on those learnings is also super valuable. And that's where documentation somewhat also comes into the mix, because then you're, pulling these different levers that ultimately allow you to then figure out, hey, this works, this doesn't work, and you're ultimately learning through that. And for me, it's been, one of the processes that, I've thoroughly enjoyed and understood that it never really truly ends, in the sense that learning each and every single day, having to get bits of information that I can ultimately learn and process and, reference and have a big picture vision or a big picture of, and ultimately compress that into a format that I can, just talk about, has been something that has been super valuable, for me, and ultimately has led me to ask the questions of how can I make each and every single video as valuable as I possibly can through my learnings, and making sure that I'm also somewhat using this as a documentation mode in terms of, using this in terms of a process loop to say, hey, I iterated on this way of thinking and this is how my way of thinking has changed over the past few months. Here's what I've gotten wrong and here's what I'm learning and constantly iterating on, because you're not always going to get every single thing right. But the things that you do get wrong, you ultimately need to have, somewhat processes, at least I believe, processes and, mechanisms that ultimately allow you to learn from those so that you can capture the full leverage that those lessons ultimately have. And so many instances in the past, I've, learned a lesson, and through learning that lesson, I was just like, hey, I've learned this lesson, and then it goes through one ear and then it goes through the other. And that is ultimately not efficient. You ultimately forget, the different learnings and different things that you've had to, go through in terms of your journey. And that was one of the reasons which ultimately made me, realize that I need to build a super airtight system that ultimately allows me to, solely organize my way of thinking, and also allows me to unpack in terms of asking deeper questions that ultimately unlock a new level of awareness. And I've mentioned this, a couple of times in much of the earlier videos, that level of awareness and just asking why 5 times and getting to the root, core of how this thing functions, or how this system or how this process functions, and solely understanding that ultimately allows you to then, understand all the moving parts, or somewhat of, the moving parts that ultimately then allow you to recognize patterns, so pattern recognition. And that pattern recognition also then allows you to then, predict what's going to happen into the future, because there's certain patterns that you may be able to pick up, and through picking up those certain patterns, those then allow you to then build, the next version of the thing that it is that you're building. And through that ultimately, makes you a sharper builder and a sharper, person as well, because you just constantly, learning and having these iteration loops where you constantly, getting knowledge and processing it and then executing it and figuring out, us by asking questions of how can I take this piece of knowledge and multiply that by a factor of 10, such so that it scales my level of impact. And not only that you also run feedback loops, which are also super important, because in as much as you can build and you can try different things, those feedback loops also keep you grounded in the sense that they, somewhat help you realize where you're getting things wrong and where you need to also, improve on as well, and where you're getting things right. And that ultimately, has been something that, has pushed me a lot in terms of just solely just understanding that each and every single day is a fresh opportunity to learn new things. And through learning those new things, you ultimately, also scale the level of impact that you have. But that ultimately comes, as a result of just, doing the work, and the work that needs to get done in order to build the future. And understanding that you're going to get things wrong, and, through getting things wrong, that's okay. But how do you learn through that? How do you build this moat of, super airtight systems that allow you to then just, build into the future? And I like using the word system so much, simply because I think a lot of things can be a lot more efficient if there's a lot more structure to it. And I always ask myself, how can I add more structure to the things that I'm doing on a day to day, such so that it ultimately, 10x's or multiplies my inputs that I'm having on a day to day, such so that my level of impact is also, multiplied by a factor of 10. I like using the factor of 10 because that ultimately, allows me to tie it to a number. Because if you don't tie things to a number, at least in my experience, then you ultimately, aren't able to quantify, or basically measure, what it is that you're doing and how you're progressing towards that. But that also means, like another big point is also measuring, how much you're learning and how much output that is ultimately, providing for you. So your input to output ratio, how is that working? Like, do you have a high input to output ratio? So basically understanding that the things that you're inputting, are you actively, output, is it actively, scaling your level of output, or is it doing the opposite? And solely just understanding that. And understanding that each and every single day is a day to, learn a bunch of different things and also implement those things as well. And that is the gift, because through those learnings and through those, absorption of knowledge and compressing and also just fully implementing as well, you're ultimately able to then build the future, at least in my experience. And you can always learn from anyone, you can always learn anything, but the question then becomes, how do you then filter the knowledge that you need in order to get to your North Star, and also making sure that you're keeping the big picture alive, and also making sure that you're building expertise as well. And I think this is also super important to ask yourself, what are the things that you're learning that directly correlate to the things that you need to be doing on a day to day? And I think that is super important, and also just allows you to keep on building. So, yeah, just a thought that I had that I thought I should share, that one of the unexpected leverage points or the unexpected things that I thoroughly enjoy from the daily videos, and also just, progressing each and every single day. I know it's like self talk, self, quote unquote motivation, that the better you get, the more you learn, the better you become as a person. And I see that to be true. And each and every single day, I'm always asking the questions of, how can I learn more such so that I become a sharper operator, and that I'm also just able to build, each and every single day through those learnings. And it's not always easy, but you find a way and you ultimately build the future through that. And I, just something that I hold strongly and dearly, and continuously going to iterate and process through. And if you guys enjoy this video, make sure to check out my newsletter. It's the first link in the description. And also, if you want to connect, X, LinkedIn, Instagram, also in the description. And I'll see you guys in the next video.